Hi, my name is Joe, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Most of what I do here is to review martial arts books. I'll also talk about a few other martial arts related subjects. So today what I'm going to be looking at is Volume 1 of the Bruce Lee's Fighting Method series. Volume 1 was specifically on self-defense. Now, some books I will review as a series in whole. With the Bruce Lee's Fighting Method series, I've decided to review them sort of individually because, frankly, they're not really interrelated very well. So, the story behind these books was that Bruce Lee initially took the photographs for them in 1966, but according to at least the introduction of the books, he declined to publish them initially because people were making claims that they taught Bruce Lee or he taught them, and these were falsehoods, and he didn't want to sort of help support those by putting his material out in the public. Instead, they were published in 1976. That's when the original copyright is from. And the first volume of the Bruce Lee Fighting System books is on self-defense. To be honest, it's a little spotty where that's concerned. Immediately, I can start to speak to the pros versus the cons. The pro is that the sequences as a whole really keep a sort of continuity with the types of techniques used. So there's a lot of side kicks to the knee, a lot of kicks to the groin, a lot of finger jabs to the eye. So those are incredibly common techniques across the board here. His self-defense methods were very uncomplicated. It's also interesting to note that two of the models in here, Dan Inosanto and Ted Wong, became very famous Jeet Kune Do instructors in their own right. Now, the book is divided into 7 chapters. Honestly, this is more pretense of organization than organization itself. There's no real distinction when you're looking at the techniques between defense against a surprise attack and defense against an unarmed assailant. And I will say something that stands out here is that, like many martial arts manuals and self-defense manuals of the time, there's a lot in the way of, knock the opponent to the ground and then kick him or stomp on him. In today's world, with the proliferation of things like closed-circuit TV and camera phones, things that you can stream online instantly, I don't think it would be a good idea to enact the self-defense techniques as they are written that end with a kick or stomp to a downed opponent. Legally speaking, in most places in the West, if the opponent is no longer presenting a clear and present physical danger, you are obligated to leave. If he's on the ground and you hit him while he's down there, under most circumstances, the way the law works in most places is that you've gone from defending yourself to committing assault. Again, Bruce Lee wasn't alone in presenting things like this, but should mention it going forward. Now, even though I praised the simplicity of some of the defenses and, again, the continuity of techniques, like you'll see a lot of the same moves done across the board throughout the book, I think in some cases they're a little too simplistic, particularly when it comes to escaping grabs. Somebody's got essentially a choke from behind, a one-arm choke from behind, and the other arm's controlling the guy's wrist, like, oh, just hit him with your other elbow. Okay, but then what? The guy's ribs aren't attacking you. Similarly, he's showing a sequence where he's being pinned in what today would be called side control. And from that position, he elects to elbow the ribs. That is not a defense that I would recommend. When you are in an inferior ground position, Your first move should be getting to at least a neutral one. Trying to start a fist fight while you're being pinned down and your movements are being limited isn't a good idea. There are other sequences that also seem a little ill-advised. For instance, some of the defenses against a staff. Bruce Lee is shown throwing what is referred to as a sweeping kick, which in other martial arts might be called a hook kick. And not only does that require kind of a degree of athleticism, you need to have the flexibility to get your leg up to the guy's face. You need to have coordination in order to hook your foot back at the correct time. I'm also not sold on the knockout ability of that move. I don't know if it, as performed, is going to have any more of effect than kind of a slap. And as somebody with a grappling background, I also sort of nitpick somewhat when I see this sequence that's referred to as defense against a half Nelson. I wouldn't call that a half Nelson. That is a chicken wing or a bar on the arm with head pressure. A Nelson travels underneath the arm before connecting with the back of the head. And that's not what's happening in this sequence. I do appreciate that he is addressing some ground fighting. I wouldn't endorse it. I would say, particularly in the 21st century, we have better answers to the problems that are being presented there. I also see a lot of sequences where he's responding to an attack with finger thrust to the eyes. This is another thing that, for modern practitioners of self-defense, we should take with a grain of salt and we should really re-examine. Basically, if somebody throws a punch at you and your response is to try to maim them, that's not going to look good for any witnesses, for any further legal action. It's not something that, again, I would recommend. Remember, in self-defense, in the aftermath of it, you need to be able to justify whatever it is that you've done. So the guy threw a punch at me, so I stuck my finger in his eye. I'm not sure how that would go down. So, again, just sort of taking things with a grain of salt. Overall, I think that there are some good concepts in this book, and like I said, I really like the continuity. You know, you're going to see the same moves show up over and over. I like the fact that he addressed groundwork, even though I'm not a big fan of how he addressed it. I do think I have a lot of problems with the place of these moves in a modern setting, under the rules and regulations that we have, under the current understanding of the law. I appreciate that Bruce Lee had a very strong eye toward physical fitness, but I just think there are several sequences where it could have been further simplified, and instead of kicking the guy in the face, or as we see in this photo, you know, kicking the hand of a guy who's wielding a knife. I mean, maybe if you're Bruce Lee, you could pull that off. I wouldn't, trust my life to that technique, Or this sequence where we see him defending a tackle by kicking a guy in the face. We have formats, San Shao, mixed martial arts, where you can do those things, where you can both tackle a guy and kick him in the face, and this move doesn't show up there. And that's not an accident. This is not a good response to at least someone trained in executing that technique. The range is off for a good wrestler. I also think it's off for the way most self-defense scenarios go down, where if you look at a lot of CCTV, if you listen to people who've been, working the door for a long time or who've been in law enforcement, most of the time violence kicks off at conversation range, not 6 feet away. There's also some idiosyncratic things in this book, like, for instance, he's showing defenses against wrist locks, which I think is interesting. But the wrist locks, I don't know what was going on in the 1960s. In today's world, wrist locks are not under the umbrella of habitual acts of self-defense. I am very unlikely to encounter somebody who's going to open up with a wrist lock. So I do find it a little unusual why this was included. I've heard that Bruce Lee, in the one book that he actually published before his death, which was The Tao of Chinese Kung Fu, I believe, that some of the sequences in that book were sort of created as sort of a dig at other Chinese martial arts authors at the time. And I sort of wonder if this might have been part of that. If, traditional jiu-jitsu had been in the West for a while now, and I'm wondering if, he was sort of taking a dig at, oh, you're going to wrist lock me? Well, here, I'm going to kick you while you're trying to do that. So I can't say for sure. And, what I'm offering is speculation based on, frankly, barely having any knowledge on the subject. But it just seems funny to me, that he would include a sequence of defenses against wrist locks at all, and then you add, maybe this other factor of, oh, this guy does this, let me show you how I counter that. If I were to put this in sequence with the other Bruce Lee's Fighting Methods books, I wouldn't make it volume 1. I find it very unusual that, book 1 is how to defend yourself, is the applications of the martial art that we're doing. And then book 2 is like, here's how to train. And, books 3 and 4 go over the technical details and, some strategic considerations. So if I were to personally rearrange this myself, I would slide those other 3 books forward a bit and take this one and actually make it volume 4. I have to say, as much as I respect Bruce Lee as an innovator, as much as he has undoubtedly been incredibly influential on the martial arts world, I'm really not a particularly big fan of this book. There's some good stuff in there, but there's also a lot of things that I personally would not endorse for friends of mine. And there are other things that, I think we have better answers to the questions that were being asked by the attacks. With that being said, it is a really interesting snapshot of where Bruce Lee was in his development during the mid-60s. So we're seeing some ideas from Wing Chun Kung Fu, but we're also seeing things like high kicks and some rudimentary grappling, and the inclusion of, so-called foul techniques like hair pulling. He's got one sequence where he's like pulling on the guy's ear. These are interesting. I think the book, to me, is most useful in that regard. It's most useful as sort of a snapshot of, this was what Bruce Lee thought self-defense looked like in 1966. So, to summarize, I think the pros of the book mostly are centered on the interchangeability and the continuity of the defense. I know I've said that more than once on here. But yeah, when every answer to everything is going to be kick him in the knee, kick him in the nuts, poke him in the eyes, punch him in the jaw. Okay, I can dig it. I think it has some historical value if you are interested in the life and personal growth of Bruce Lee. The cons, there are many things in this book that I would not endorse as self-defense methods today, or that I would have to heavily qualify. A lot of things where a guy goes to punch you and you poke him in the eyes. A lot of like use of force issues where I think you're going to an extreme. You're using excessive force for the scenario you're in. There are some sequences that are dependent on being incredibly athletic, having great flexibility, great speed, great coordination, and I don't think the average person, or even the journeyman in many cases, would be able to pull off a whole lot of the stuff he's showing the way he's showing it. And then just a bit of a personal gripe. I don't think gripe's the right word. Personal preference. I would prefer if this had been the last book in the Bruce Lee's Fighting Method series as opposed to Volume 1. I think it would make more sense that way, where we got to see the actual training methods and went further in depth on the techniques themselves before showing an application of those techniques for self-defense. So overall, if you're a Bruce Lee fan, this might be a nice book to get. If you are interested in the development of Jeet Kune Do, it might be a good book to get. If you are interested in self-defense, in realistic self-defense, using realistic ranges, using realistic athletic abilities, using realistic use of force options, this is not a book that I could recommend. But it is a nice piece of history, though. Anyway, thank you once again for looking at my channel. Please subscribe, like, leave a comment if you want. Have a good day.